This is my video on how to go from essentially image to Blender to TaleWeaver to make Standee minis. I'll take things slow. The concepts in this video may be daunting to some people they may be old hat, but we will go over kind of each of the steps, and if you feel very confident in a certain area, always feel free to skip ahead. I use this sort of as a slide format so that you can just sort of browse the top and go by topic that way if you feel confident. And if you're not interested in my explanations and seeing all my mistakes, then you can skip ahead to the end where I put all the pieces together and just do it very fast in a sort of show don't tell sort of method. But if you're new to Blender and new to the concept, you probably just want to watch the whole thing through or follow along with your chosen image and just sort of play along with me as we go through this. Like I said, this is aimed at beginners, so we'll take it slow and just go from there. So the first question you may have is, why bother making Standee minis? There are a number of mods available, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more soon on great minis that are available with professional levels of detail, so why bother with it at all? Well, one of the things that came up and one of the hesitations that my players had when starting with using Talespire is, does this detract from the game to have minis represented very detailed? This goes back into the concept of the theater of the mind. In other words, do we gain anything by having had highly detailed minis versus how it used to be, where you really just had a pin drawing, a stack of dimes, whatever you had hanging around the table, where a Dr. Pepper can could be your big boss of the day. The basic concept being that if things get too detailed or too well represented, does it actually detract from the player's imagination of what's going on? Now, this goes kind of into a separate philosophical conversation, and by all means, I fully support the level of effort and detail that are going into the amazing digital minis we have out there. I have a 3D printer myself. I model, I print, and I paint minis for my own games. But at the end of the day, I have certain tokens that can represent anything from a swarm of lizards to a pirate king, and that's to say that anything can work. And if nothing is a perfect match, sometimes something that is low or just loosely a prop may be better, because it allows players to imagine what's there rather than having it occupied by something that isn't a representative. Plus, Standees are kind of fun, and it allows you to take your own talent or inspiration and apply it in a no skills, low skills sort of approach to things. I also think it's a good baseline to learn some new skills. So maybe you've thought about picking up Blender, or you want to draw a bit more, or you just have some doodles you'd like to transfer in. You could totally do that. And I think it's a good opportunity to pick up those new skills and start off learning, because there's so much information out there that you can just take and glean from and go with. So this is kind of aimed at gathering on all those things. I taught myself Blender. I'm not a professional at it. You'll probably find that very obvious when you watch me work. But I think it just goes to show that there's so much free information out there, and you can really teach yourself any new skill so long as you set your mind to it. So just to review what we're going to go over and get all the steps completed. The first step is going to be preparing our image. That can be done a lot of different ways. So we'll do that first. The next stage is going to be making your 3D Standee in Blender, which may be a little daunting if you've never used Blender, but we're going to go through all the steps fairly slowly, and it actually is pretty easy once you break it down. Then we're going to do another step in Blender that some people find daunting, which is making the UV for your Standee and matching it to your image. This becomes more complicated when you have three-dimensional figures and you're doing a lot of details. But for our Standees, this process will be really easy, and if you haven't done UVs before, it'll be a good introduction. So there's that. And then finally, the easiest step is actually creating the Talespire mini mod in TaleWeaver. So we will just kind of go through all those. We'll take our time. This is really aimed, I think I said before, at beginners. So don't be daunted. You can pause. And also don't be daunted by the length of the video. I just want to take things slowly and make sure everyone's got all the steps, and I'll explain as I go along. Alright, so our first step will be preparing our image. Now, this is probably a stage that a lot of people might already feel comfortable with, so I'm just going to let you know there's hundreds of ways to do this probably. The main goal is to have a dual image on the background of your choice with some extra space around it. This might be an image you've borrowed or taken from your own drawings, or like in this case I've got a screenshot from a video game in my second option versus a doodle. That said, what I'm going to be explaining in this step is how to do these in Windows Paint 3D. I chose that because it's free. If you have Windows, you probably already have it installed. That said, I know a lot of people who get into this kind of creative work already are familiar with Photoshop or GIMP or ArtRage or any number of programs that have layers and editing abilities, and you may already know how to separate out images. If that's the case, just move along through these steps. This is going to be just if you don't have those options and you have a picture or a screenshot or a drawing, or you don't yet and you want to draw one, this is going to go through how to start from there. So like I said, if you got your fancy pants on, you can move along, because we're going to take just a little time with this. So before we go into the actual Paint 3D, the decision you want to make first is what you want your background to be. I've got some examples here. The first examples, and the last example, are simply flat colors. The first one's kind of a flat light gray, the last is a flat red. That's literally just the color, a flat color, nothing else, no textures. The other two, one is sort of a corkboard that ends up on the Mini looking a bit like particle board, and the other one is a wood texture I picked up, and it really has a nice look on the Mini. That said, plain flat colors are fine. One of the things that happens in TaleWeaver is there's a checkbox that lets you apply a wash to the Mini. Now this wash applies a little bit of texturing, a little bit of matting to make the Mini look like it's hand painted and a little bit more figurative. So if you'll notice here in that first big image where I've got the red kind of zoomed in on the blobby top of my Standee, you'll see that there is a lot of actual detail that gets added, and this can make these mini Standees really pop out, and we'll get into that later with TaleWeaver, but I guess that's all to say, don't be afraid of a flat image or just something that is a solid color. Go with what you want. I think the woods look really good. I think the cork looks really good. But there's not really a wrong answer, especially if you've got several things and you want color to help represent which is which. The red one this, the blue one does that, things like this. So just embrace the fact that simple can be good. Right, so this assumes you already have your image, that you have your texture downloaded, assuming you want to use a textured image, and you can simply insert it into Paint 3D by selecting it and inserting it. You'll notice when you insert that the proportions are not going to necessarily be what you want, and you can see this there, or by going into your canvas. You'll see the height and width aren't square. This isn't super important, but I like to make sure it's cleaned up. So I lock the ratios. I change 1 to, say, 1024. And then I unlock the ratios, that way it doesn't stretch it, and I do the other one. This way it creates a cropped image rather than a stretched image, which is kind of handy. So from there, you can simply export the file. Once again, the goal here is simply to get a base background file we can use with a texture that has a ratio that we want. So I go for square. It's whether or not that's a necessary step, people can combat me on for sure, but it's how I work. It's part of my workflow. You can do it at 1024 or 1024 pixels or by 2048. You may want to choose the lower resolution to start, depending on the resolution of the image you're going to superimpose. If you do that, if you're drawing, it really doesn't matter. And quite frankly, for Talespire minis, that really high resolution isn't necessary. Now let's say you just want to use a basic solid color. You can do the same thing. You start with a white background, go to your canvas, change your height and width. In this case, it doesn't matter if you like the aspect ratios or not. You basically just dial in what you want. In this case, I'm lowering the resolution because I know the image I'm going to superimpose isn't super high resolution and it'd be too small when I import it, so I'd go there. Now I want to select the background color. I can choose the paint bucket, which is the last option, and then I can select from the existing colors, but I think they're a bit too bright and garish, so I can go into the edit color and pick something maybe a bit darker, maybe a bit more what I'm looking for. And that's really all there is to getting the base color. Now I like to save this as a separate image before I draw on it. That way I can use it again if I've got multiples, so I'm going to just go save as and save it as a PNG, just like I did before. So now that we have our backgrounds, we can pick one. In this case, I'm choosing to doodle on one of the textured backgrounds that I made. So I just open it, and here I'm just kind of playing with the pins. Now, if I'm doing a doodle, I don't necessarily want to draw directly on the background. I'm setting up just sort of a white baseline for what I think I'm going to draw. This is completely optional, but I find it makes the little stick figure pop and look a bit more like you've cut out a piece of paper and just sort of stuck it on to the to the background. One key part here is you want to have a reverse of what you've got. This gets a little tricky because I want that exact same image in reverse. So I can go to Select and Magic Select. Now Magic Select is a neat feature of Paint 3D that lets you sort of take out things and make them stickers. So you can see what I've done is I just went to the default. It automatically knew what I wanted and I've selected it. Now I can move it around. Isn't that neat? So I want to make a copy of it, and now I've got 2 of them. And then I can just flip it by creating a mirror. And that's all I need to do. And now I've got the baseline for the front and back of my little mini that I can draw on. This gets kind of helpful when I start actually drawing because I want to pretend that one part is the front face of my little character and one part is the back. Now there's a lot of different drawing tools that are meant to look like crayon or pencil or marker, and some of them are quite fun. I played a little bit with them before this, but I find the marker at a high opacity probably sells it quite well. So I say just play, decide what you like. It doesn't have to be perfect, just have fun with it. So now you get to watch me. I'll probably speed up the video here. Just watch me draw. And then all you have to do is then, once again, save the image as an exported PNG. Now let's say we have an existing image that we want to use. Like before, I'm going to use the Magic Select brush. So in this case, I have taken an image from Grounded of Willow, who's my favorite character, and I'm trying to isolate that image so the Magic Select brush can take out her in her air guitar glory, and I can maybe use that just for some fun. But what you'll notice here is that it's not doing a great job at picking out the character that I'm trying to get. It keeps grabbing parts of the background. This happens when your image is a little too cluttered and it's difficult for a program, especially like Paint 3D or things that are a bit simpler, to detach that as a separate image. So what ended up happening here is I use this example to show you how it can go poorly, and I struggle with it a bit. You know, you change the settings, you fuss with it, and ultimately you may find that it is a bit too much work. And if you're doing something like this where you're grabbing a capture of a character from a video game or maybe a drawing that you've done, find another way to try to isolate out the image. There are programs like GIMP and Photoshop where you can actually go very carefully and manually remove something from the background and transparencies. If you're interested in doing that, I would say look up videos on transparencies and layering. GIMP's an awesome program for that. But in terms of if you're just trying to use something simple like Paint 3D and you have the option, it sometimes is better just to pick a new image, because as you see, Paint 3D is struggling a little bit here with my isolation. I'll be honest, I've also used Word to isolate images when I'm in a trying to do some things really rapidly. So explore what tools you have out there, but as you can see, having an image that's more isolated starts you off at a better spot. So now I've gone back into Grounded and taken a new screenshot of Willow doing her air guitar, and this time I've chosen to get in front of some boulders and the rock wall just to simplify it. Now you can see that the magic wand pretty much perfectly picked up the outline of the figure. I just have to use the remove eraser to grab a section and remove that part, and it's really perfect. I chose to also try to remove the shadow underneath. In hindsight, I probably should have kept it, so you don't necessarily have to do that. They can add depth, but they might also add confusion. But in this case, I'm pretty satisfied. I know I missed part of the shoe there, but it's good enough for jazz, so I'm done. Now, you have the image isolated out, which is really handy. What you want to do is make a sticker. So under stickers, you go to make sticker and check it. You can see I had a sticker I played with earlier when I was messing around. But basically what this does is it separates the isolated images out so that you can use them later. And this can be really handy. As you see, it kind of lowers the resolution a bit, I think. So it may not be a perfect science, but once again, it's free, and I was able to do it in a few seconds, really, if I had a good image. And so now I can take that, and we can superimpose it on our purple background that I have. And here we are. Now, once we're in our image, we still have those stickers available because we saved them, and I can just drop them in. I can resize them a bit, but it doesn't always preserve my proportions correctly, but if you hold shift, sometimes that helps you get there. I want to get it big enough that it's isolated on the page, but gives me enough extra room around the image so that I can make sure I have enough cleared out space to have my borders of the standee covered. So when you when you put in a sticker and you place it, it is permanently part of the image. So you want to make sure when you're clicking the sticker and you're placing it, you're using the drag handles to do your sizing, to flip it using the flip and getting it sort of correct how you want it before you sort of let go and commit the toggles like that. So now you can see I've got Willow A and B reversed and forward, and that is going to be great for what I use. Now, I considered maybe I want these to look more like stickers and less like just the image, and so I'm going to take some white and actually just paint over everything that I did. I make it a little gray so it's not so harsh, because I theorized that maybe I would want to have that sort of old school, like school book sticker kind of look going on. So I'm going to work on that for a second. Now, ultimately, I didn't like the look. I thought, it just doesn't sell it for me as much as like having the white border around the doodle, I think really helped rather than just doodling directly on the wood. But it really is up to you on what you like or what you think works for you, what's your aesthetic you're going for. And honestly, at the end of the day, there's really no right or wrong. You'll see I sort of fuss and tweak when I work. But this kind of used the same principles I did before, where I took the image, did the outline, did the reversal, same sort of thing as before. Once you're satisfied with what you have, just save the image as a solid image as a PNG, and you're done. So what I'm doing is I'm just opening up a default Blender, which starts with a basic cube. Then I'm going to add our reference image by going to Add, Image, Reference. This just superimposes an image into the 3D world of Blender, but you'll notice something here. So if I'm pulling an image in and just staying at the default view, and I load it, that it is kind of wonky. It's not really on a flat plane that I want to work with, so I'm going to undo that. I'm going to align the plane using the widget in the corner so that it's looking at it as if it's two-dimensional. This is how we're going to work with at least our start in terms of plane shaping. So now we can go back to Add, Image, Reference Image, and this time we'll grab, I believe, a good old Dagger Dave that I made earlier. Alright, so now that Dave's in here, I kind of confirm we're all on the same plane, everything's nicely aligned. I'm going to set the cube to be somewhat transparent, which is sort of by toggling it being there, then the view through option so I can see through it. Then I'm going to take the reference image and just scoot it up so I can kind of see what, sort of get it aligned with where I'm going to be working. Same thing with the cube. Now, it's a cube right now. We don't want it to be a cube, ultimately. We want it to be a simple plane, so we're going to go into Edit mode. Now, we want to grab the face of the cube. So you'll see I have in that top corner next to Edit mode the face selected. That lets me grab single faces. Now, I can select the inverse of the faces. So I've grabbed that front face, I've selected inverse, and now I've deleted the other parts of the cube so I have a single plane. Now, with my single plane, I can go to Point Select, which is selecting vertices only, and I can tweak them with the sort of the tweak tool, and I can move them to wherever I need them to be. The basic idea here is that we're going to create a shape outline that gives us the general shape. It doesn't have to be perfectly smooth, as you'll see, because we're going to use a modifier to smooth it out once we get it into 3D. So to get this working, we're going to kind of shape it where we want to start, and then we're going to use a combination of the extrusion and the sort of bisect tool. The extrusion tool is right there, and you'll notice I start extruding. Well, in that case, I'm not really getting what I want because I'm extruding just a vertices. So what I want to do is select the edge, which is the second option. And now I can extrude and extrude. But if I'm just using the default tool, I'm going to be extruding at some angles that I don't want. We can see how that plane actually is three-dimensionally arcing out into space. So we're going to undo that. And we're going to select, instead of extruding along what is referred to as the normals, we're going to extrude along the XYZ plane. So go to Extrude, select your edge, and select the second option, which is XYZ. So now we see we've got the handles that let us extrude in different directions, such as your Z-plane, your Y-plane, your X-plane. So that is how we'll sort of control what we're doing. We just want to extrude along our Z-axis and get lots of little boxes to work with. It really doesn't matter. We can add in more later if we need, but I like to kind of start off with a good full palette to give me a little wiggle room to go with. Once we've extruded out a good amount, then we can go back to the original thing we were doing, which is just grabbing the vertices and tweaking them. So we go to our little tweak cursor to grab, and we just sort of grab each one and just pull them where we want them to be. Just remember, as you're making your tweaks, it doesn't have to be perfect. You just want to kind of get a generalization of the figure. It's going to get smoothed out. One thing you do want to avoid are, well, it depends on how you do your bevel. If you're beveling at all, we're going to go over 2 different bevel methods. If you are beveling your figure, you want to make sure that you don't have a lot of sharp edges, because that will cause some complications. There are things you can work around, but I'm not going to necessarily cover all the details of that in this video. So for our purposes, we want to make sure that we're having pretty soft curves and corners. We don't want to have inverse areas, things like that. You can do those, absolutely you can, but I'm not going to cover them in this video. And here at the end, I'm kind of wanting to create a little, I'll have to soften the curves a bit, but creating like a little standee bit so that when I put it into the Talespire thing, it actually looks like it's slotted into the base as if there were a little slot there. So one thing I'm not doing a lot in what you're seeing is using the, what I sometimes call the knife tool or the bisect tool, but if I'm using the correct term, it's loop cut. And the loop cut is where if I grab the loop cut, it looks like a little knife, and if I put it over an edge, it splits that edge into 2. And this is what you can do if you need to add more detail in the middle, but you've already done a lot of extrusion. Now, we can simply take this and go with it. We could also take a pause and see how it compares to the flipped image. That's not really necessary because we know we kind of accounted for that when we created the image. If you didn't and you're not sure that it's going to capture your front and back equally well, you can take your reference image and either flip it or rotate it and make sure that the shape you have will work for both your front and your back. Otherwise, we'll just keep moving forward with the one we got. Now that we have our plane shaped like we want it, we want to make sure it's scaled correctly. So I'm going to go back into object mode and take off my transparency. And I want to get this to where it falls kind of in what I consider normal dimensions. This may be a carryover from my 3D printing experience, so it's just maybe one of those odd steps that I do, but I find that it works, so I'm going to go ahead and go through it. So what I want to do is I want to get my dimensions closer to a 25mm height. Now, that stretches it a lot, but we're generalizing. I just want to kind of get the ballpark of what the scale change is. In this case, we've basically gone from a 1 scale to a 10 scale. So I'm just going to even that out across and make all of the X, Y, and Z at 10 times what they were before. So that's fine. Now, I want to kind of recenter this to where it's falling at our nexus in the middle. What I'll do to do that is you'll go into Object and you're going to set the origin to the center of either mass or volume. This recenters the origin to sort of the center of our plane instead of hanging out here at the bottom or at our nexus point. So from there, I'm going to readjust the X and the Y so that it is dead center. The Z I'm less concerned about because mentally I think about my mini standing on the top of my Z axis, so that's actually up quite a bit from the baseline. But this makes me happy, so I'm going to go with it. To make sure that we don't have problems down the road, we want to apply the transformations. So where this is all times 10, we have some new locations here, we want to go back to Object and Apply, and go ahead and apply all transforms. So you'll see what happens is it now assumes its native location is there, native rotation is that, and the native scale is just 1. So it's accepted all this as our new object. So now that we have our shape lined out, we're going to look at how we would do a hard edge bevel. Now, getting a bevel is a subtle sort of addition, especially when it's a hard edge bevel. A hard edge bevel is a little bit easier than the soft bevel, and I don't know, maybe it kind of is, but let's talk about just how to get this 3D first. So to get it 3D, we want to select all of our planes. So here I am on sort of the face select. I've selected everything. We're still in edit mode, and I'm going to go to extrude region. Now we simply extrude the region out to make it into a three-dimensional shape. If you have a specific amount, you'll notice that as soon as you remove the handle, you have the option to choose. So if I want this to be, you know, a 1 millimeter or whatever sort of extrusion, it's there, it's done. So I can click it off. So now we have a 3D shape. For doing a hard bevel, we want to go ahead and smooth things first before we do our bevel. So I'm going to go into object mode, and we're going to do a series of modifiers. So on our side, the modifiers is the little sort of wrench icon. If you click there, you add modifiers. We're going to add a edge split modifier, and we're going to add a subdivision surface modifier. Now, this won't look right at first. You'll see some gaps because our edge split is set to 30 degrees. If we change that to 89 degrees, it's going to catch all the edges that are not quite up to that 90 degrees, so it should make sure our plane stays separate, and it's just doing our edges. Under subdivision surface, if you want to make it a little extra curvy, you can add a little more detail like that by going up to 1 or 2 or 3. Don't go beyond 3, really. Your system will hate you. The subdivision surface is actually fairly resource intensive, so if you start getting lag, back off. Definitely don't put high numbers in there. You'll crash your system. So we can apply these. Now, one problem we're going to have is that edge split literally splits those edges away, so it's treating them as 3 separate mesh parts where we've got a front, a back, and a side. We want to remerge them. To do that, we're going to go into edit mode, and it looks like it's solid, but I guarantee you it's not, because if we select everything with A, and we go to mesh and merge, so we go to mesh merge by distance. And at the bottom you'll see it says it removed 672 vertices. Now, I know that this tends to be a bit finicky, so sometimes I might adjust my merge distance, tweak it up just a little bit, so I might say 0.0, maybe 1, or I might say, let's just do 0.5, just to kind of see what it's going to remove. And sometimes it removes a few more, sometimes it doesn't, but I'm pretty fussy with it. So let's go back into object mode, and now we've got this lovely 3D version. The edges are smooth, they're all intact, and we're going to add our bevel modifier. Now, the defaults to the bevel modifier might not always be what you want. They've got one segment. You'll notice it is very, very subtle. If you increase the offset amount, you'll notice sometimes it just sort of stops. That is related to what it does, where it sort of clamps and limits the bevel so that it doesn't go absolutely crazy. So like you'll see here, if I say no, absolutely do this, it's going to start really not knowing what to do in terms of maintaining a 3D shape. Sometimes the edges get a little weird, but you know, play with it, see what you like. My recommendation is to stick with some of the basics. So if we just go to the offset, which is fairly basic, and we set our segments up a bit, like to 3 or 4, we'll notice we start getting this nice, soft, subtle bevel. And we can increase this a bit, but you'll notice once again it stops once it thinks it can't give you a clean edge. And that's really all there is to what I call like a hard beveled edge. This hard beveled edge is simply, I don't want it to be, if I take off the view, I don't want it to look crisp like cut plastic or cut glass. I want it to look a little worn, a little more natural, so you just have a nice soft bevel in there. Once you have that, you just click apply. Alright, now I'm going to show you how to do a soft edge bevel. Most of my examples in the video are based off this because I like the look of it, and this is where you have a standee where the edges look really worn and it looks more like someone sanded down a piece of wood. So first thing I want to do is be a little more careful with my extrusions, because I'm going to use the extrusions as the basis for my bevel. So I'm going to select everything, and I know overall I want the width to be about 1 millimeter, so I might say let me do my first extrusion at, I don't know, maybe 0.25, and then my second extrusion at 0.5, and then my third extrusion at another 0.25. And what I'm basically telling it here is I'm setting up that I want this much bevel. Now, looking at that, I kind of want a little more than that to make it all roundy, but it'll come out in the subdivision surface, so let's just go with it and see how it looks. Now, that I've got my extrusion set, I want to get my bevels going. So I'm going to select the edges of one of my faces by getting my select circle. So you'll notice there's some options here. Select circle lets me sort of drag over a region. and I'm going to select all the faces on one side. Now, if I just go to bevel by doing a bevel here, you'll notice it gets a little funky because it's trying to bevel into itself. What we want to do is only have the edges selected. So to do that, I'll now switch over to Edge Select, and it still has everything selected, but I can now take my cursor, and by using the Control key, I can unselect the middle edges and just have my loop. Then I can bevel. So bevel, and you'll notice I can kind of bevel right up to the line, and that gives me a nice soft bevel. So I'll repeat it on the other side. So now I've got kind of a good bevel going all the way around. Probably could have been a bit more extreme, but I dig it. So now we're going to go back into object mode. And now we see our nicely beveled object, but we want to really smooth it out. To do that, we're just going to use the modifier subdivision surface. Now, it is really, really smoothing over the surface, not really an issue. I'd say put it at like a 2 or a 3. I would not go beyond that. I think I mentioned before, your computer will hate you if you try to bevel or try to do a subdivision surface that's very high, and you will crash things. It's a very, very resource-intensive thing. So we're going to apply that. Now, because this is such a high, has become sort of a high-resolution mesh, we are going to need to break it down. So we're going to explain how to do that in a second. Now, with our Standees, we are not going to have super complex meshes. So once again, this is sort of my super soft edge one that I made a moment ago. And if I look at it in the sort of wireframe view, you'll notice you can kind of see how many little mesh parts there are. It's a lot, but compared to some of the 3D modeling, it's actually not that complicated. You can check this by adding a modifier called decimate. This isn't perfect, but it will give you the face count here. So by default, it's showing you a collapse decimate with no collapse being done. And we can see that we have 16,000 faces. Now that translates to a lot more vertices. So when you're putting this in Talespire, it might be like, ooh, that's kind of big. So you want to simplify it as best you can. So we want to look at it as the object appears. Looks nice and smooth. We have several options for decimate. We can do a planar decimate, and we can kind of see what the wireframe ends up looking like. Planar decimate I find to be a little hit and miss. Sometimes it is the golden ticket, other times it's not, because it does some chunkiness in odd places. And if you're doing 3D printing, you absolutely would not use this because it doesn't triangulate your meshes. If we go to the collapse one, and we can choose to triangulate, which will give us a better idea of our vertices, we can basically kind of adjust it. And you'll see that I can get down pretty far before I lose, to nothing here. It's chunky, but once we put it in Talespire, it's probably not going to be too bad. And you can see this is only 1,700-ish faces. Now, I don't think I need to go down that far. I might choose to just go to, say, a ratio of 0.25, which is at 25%. That brings me down to 8,000 faces, which is probably just fine. It still looks really good, so I think that's what we're going to do. Now, if you have something very complicated, you might actually do multiple decimations and do them in sort of iterations. That really won't be necessary for what we're doing. This is really all we need to do to reduce our mesh complexity. So now that we have our lovely beveled mesh, we've decided how we want it sort of decimated down so it's not overly complicated. Now we can just take it and do what's called a UV unwrap to get the UV. Now UV doesn't stand for anything fancy. It actually is just essentially the X and Y of the 2D space. Since X, Y, and Z are already occupied, they use U and V to represent those planes. So it is basically just going to unfold this as if it were made of solid object and put it to where we can put a texture on it. So that is done in UV editing. Now when I open this up, you're going to see some of my work from before, so just kind of ignore that. But on one side, we see our 3D mesh. On the other side, you'll start with a blank image. You won't have anything there yet. So let's start with the first part. we can select our image to sort of simplify, and I'll choose who I've dubbed Dagger Dave for this. So he's over there now. We've got that image selected. This doesn't actually superimpose the image onto the object in Blender, but it gives us our reference point to know what we're doing. So now in this window, we want to select the entire mesh. You can do that with A. And you'll see it's kind of got, this is sort of what we got so far. That's not what we want. We want to unwrap it. This is actually pretty easy. So if we go to the UV option and do Smart UV Project. Now you're going to have some options here. The only option I would change is the island margin. I like this because we're going to be moving our UV mesh around a little bit to get it where we want it. So I normally put this at like a 0, just like a 0.1 to give me a little space. So I'm just going to do that and say OK. And so now we can kind of scoot this window over and give us this working room. So this worked pretty well. We can see that it unwrapped it in sort of a logical way. We say there's a front, there's a back, there's all of our little sides. So not a lot to worry about here. What we want to do now is get these guys here, the sort of the mesh, to be aligned with our figures. If you can't see them really well, it might be because you're not showing it as see-through. So just make sure if you need to see your options, you can kind of scoot this way over, back and forth. But I could go make sure that's transparent. So I'm working over here, and I believe there's similar options over here. But the default, I think, is pretty easy to see through. So now I'm going to just go and see what I can get here. So first thing is I want to get these guys aligned, so I'll take my select box and I'll select those meshes. They're nice and isolated, and I'm going to move them out a bit. I want to work with one at a time, but since I'm going to be doing some resizing, I want them to be resized the same way. So I'm actually going to take this guy, and I honest, this is a little confusing which is the front and the back when I planned it, so we're just going to go with this because it fits. And I am going to start my resize. Now I'm keeping these two together when I resize because it'll be easier. That way I just have to rotate the second one. So kind of do a move, a little bit of resize. Is it too tall? Let's go back to the resize option. Scoot it down. And move it over. And let's see if I kind of zoom in a little bit. Now, if you're at a spot where you're trying to do this and you are really close to your other mesh, or let's say you're trying to grab this one but they overlap a bit, you can always grab part of a mesh, and a neat trick is you can just hit Control and the plus sign on your number pad, and it will start grabbing all the connected vertices, so just like that, which is kind of fun to watch. But regardless, let me re-grab these back and get these situated. You can see here why I didn't want these to be too close. I want to have those spaces in when I'm doing my drawing because I don't want my UVs to touch. Alright, so that's getting Dave in place. Now, these guys I'm not too worried about. They're just the borders. They're going to have wood on them. If there's a lot of darkness in one area and lightness in another, I might want them all on an area that is lighter wood. That way they all kind of blend together. So I might say just move these guys to here. And maybe move these guys just up and over a little bit so they're all in kind of a similar color tone. But otherwise, this is good to go. You're done. So now you may be asking yourself, does the image here matter? It doesn't. This image is going to go away once we close it. Technically, if you wanted to, you could texture draw on your 3D object and it would show up on your image over here, which is a neat thing to do, and you can look into that by looking at texture painting in Blender. I might go into something to do with that in a later video, but for right now I'm just going to leave this as is. We've unwrapped it, and now that's part of the object as Blender remembers it. So we want to export it out as such. To do that, we can just go back to File, and go to Export, and export as an object. Now, if I click this now, it isn't going to have anything really to export, and you'll get an empty file. So I want to just to assure myself, I'm going to go back to object mode, and I'm going to select the object I want. And this is the one I want to export. So if you have been using the same file for a lot of different objects, that's fine. This is the Standee I want to export. So File, Export, Wavefront Object, and you want to make sure you check Limit to Selected Only. This is not checked by default. You want to make sure you're only exporting the single mesh. And I've got my name, I've got that, and I export it, and that will export the mesh with the UV unwrap so that it knows where to find it in the image. So the final step, and also what I find to be one of the easiest steps, is actually the one in TaleWeaver. Now, the instructions for TaleWeaver are on the Talespire site, so these may change as they change the releases. But basically, you are going to import your assets. Now, those assets are going to be the image of the sort of that texture that you made, and then the Standee object. So once those are imported, they're going to show up in your browser at the bottom for the project. Now, don't get too excited. Mine's messy because I've been doing this a bit, but you will have your Standee then show up normally by the name default. It might not be turned the right way, so just go in, click it, and then change the rotation, and that will set you up straight. So just it's over there on the side once you have your object selected, kind of like in Blender had the transform information there. And you can kind of reposition, move it how you want to make sure it sits under the Standee correctly on the little base. Once you have the Standee, you'll see you also have these options for reducing mesh complexity in TaleWeaver. That's not really necessary. I don't know the formulas that go into it, so I've been skipping it and just doing it in Blender. Now, then you want to select your texture. It'll show up in the list once you import it. Once you import it, you may notice it's flipped the wrong way, or your mesh has been backwards. Then you can just flip it around. Like in this case, it was 90 degrees. I needed to go at negative 90 degrees, or vice versa. And now we really have everything set, and it's pretty much ready to go. The other thing we'll want to do is you'll notice it might say textures not readable. You'll have a button there at the bottom where you can simply click it and it'll make some adjustments to the import so it works. The other option you have is adding a paint wash. So this is a basic feature that adds in, it's kind of hard to see in this example, but it adds just a light texturing and a light finish that gives most of the minis in Talespire that look. So like little fingerprinting, little paint strokes. So once you've done that or chosen if you want to use it or not, then there is sort of making sure the rotation, the translation, and scale are correct. So it kind of runs you through that. You just kind of go down the list. We've already done our translation, rotation. Now it's scale. So it's going to give you options to see what other minis are scaled like in Talespire so you can change it. So I'm going to adjust the scale a little bit to just a 0.9. A little goes a long way, and now we can see that little dagger Dave is a somewhat short rogue, and I think that's how I want to keep it. Now you select the different targets for spells. Like I said, the instructions are here, and for each one of these you're going to have a little widget that you can drag around, and this is going to be for like the head target, the body target, where do spells get cast from, where do spells attack, where does the torch exist on the mini, which should be out in front. So you kind of reset those little widgets to be where those indicators suggest. Now, then it'll ask you to create a thumbnail, and you have like a little camera that you move around here. When you move that around, you'll see it change your thumbnail preview. Then you select the same for the photo. Now that's going to determine what shows up in the little box for the mini, for like when they're in initiative, or when the players got them selected, or when you have them selected. And that's all there is to it. So then you can just save, name the miniature mod, and add it in. Now, right now, this does not, can't be imported to Talespire yet. This is a mid-December, right after the release, and that's coming very soon. So hopefully my statement that you can't yet will be outdated very shortly, and we can look forward to playing with our minis in Talespire. Hope you enjoyed watching the quick go through and maybe picked up on a few things there. But the last tip I'll say is that if you have an image that works and you've got a Standee that works, you don't need to do the process all the way through every time. If you've got a Standee shape that you know you can use for multiple things, well, don't bother with recreating a mesh. Use the same one. And you can basically use your previous image and draw over it. Or if you know basically where things are, you kind of know where your borders are, and as long as you stay within those borders, you can keep putting new images onto the same Standee and never have to go back into Blender. And that's all I have. So thank you for watching. I hope you all were able to learn something from this and enjoy making things in TaleWeaver and Talespire. So yeah, go out, be creative, have fun.